The rain on Soreth smelled like burnt copper and old wood. Nobody told Rail that before he landed. He stepped off the shuttle ramp, breathed it in once, and filed it away the same way he filed everything, quietly, without comment. Useful later. The briefing had happened 3 days ago on a cooperative transit station. Orbiting the gas giant above, 12 species represented, 6 of them arguing. Rail had sat at the far end of the table and drunk water. The mission was simple on paper. A Sulvari cultural delegation wanted to reach a buried artifact chamber deep in the fungal forests of this moon. The chamber was old, older than Sulvari spaceflight, older than their written records. Oru, the elder who had spent 40 years triangulating its location from fragments of oral tradition, called it a place of return. The cooperative called it a Category 7 biosphere. That meant something large lived there, something that had never learned to be afraid of other things. The group needed a rated escort. Only one name on the list held a Class 7 certification. That name was Rail. Dova had objected immediately. She was Sulvari, insectoid, precise, the kind of mind that trusted numbers more than instinct. She had pulled up the comparative species index on the briefing room display and walked through it like a prosecutor. Humans were not the fastest. They were not the strongest. Their sensory range was average at best. Their natural armor was essentially nothing. In every measurable category that mattered for a Class 7 environment, they ranked somewhere in the middle. I am not questioning his individual record, she said, not looking at Rail. I am questioning the logic of sending a species with no notable biological advantages into a threat environment of this classification. The mission coordinator, a tired Borati bureaucrat named Voss, rubbed the bridge of whatever passed for his nose. The budget is signed, Dova. He's rated. Nobody else's. We go. Dova looked at Rail then. He looked back. He did not argue. He did not list his credentials or explain himself. He refilled his water from the jug in the middle of the table and looked out the viewport at the moon below. She found that more irritating than if he had argued. The surface team was 5. Dova with her scanner and her certainty. Bren A. Torati male, broad as a cargo container, who handled the engineering equipment and spoke in short, cheerful sentences that somehow always landed kind. His younger sibling Sura, also Torati, smaller and faster, who was the group medic and had the sharpest tongue Rail had heard in any species. And Oru, the elder, who moved slowly and said little and whose eyes, when he looked at the forest, held something that resembled grief and hope in equal measure. And Rail, he had one bag. Inside it, a carbon composite blade as long as his forearm, a flare kit, 3 days of ration packs, a first aid roll, and a small handheld device that none of the others recognized. Bryn asked about the device on the walk from the shuttle pad to the forest edge. He asked in the direct Torati way, which meant he simply pointed at it. Measures fear response pheromones, Rail said. In megafauna. Bren looked at the device, then at Rail. Why? So I know what I'm dealing with before I can see it. Sura, walking behind them, said, and if it reads something? Then I know early. Dova, ahead of them, did not turn around, but her antenna shifted slightly in. The way that, Rail had already learned, meant she was listening harder than she wanted to. The forest was not like any forest Rail had worked in before. The fungal trunks were enormous, wider than buildings, rising into a canopy so thick that the light came through in long pale columns, slow and diffuse, like light through deep water. The ground was soft underfoot. Spores drifted in the air, faintly, luminescent even in daylight, glowing a soft blue-white that made everything look slightly unreal. It was genuinely beautiful. Rail noticed that and moved on. What he paid more attention to were the sounds. The forest had sounds the way all large ecosystems did, background noise, layered, constant. He listened to the layers, small movement in the undergrowth, whine through the upper canopy, something dripping far to the left. He cataloged each one and kept walking. 20 minutes in, he stopped at the base of a massive trunk and crouched. There was a gouge in the bark, deep, clean-edged, roughly the width of his forearm. It sat at a height of almost 3 meters off the ground. He did not say anything. He looked at the direction the gouge faced, away from their planned path, not toward it. He stood up and kept walking. Dova had watched him crouch and stand. What was that? Territory marking, he said. From what species? Don't know yet. She opened her mouth. He was already walking. She closed it and followed, and, for the first time on this mission, felt the faint and deeply unwelcome sensation that she was the one keeping up with him, rather than the other way around. Behind her, Bryn glanced at the gouge as he passed. He looked at where it sat. On the trunk, high, deep, confident. He looked at the forest around them. He said nothing either, but he walked a little closer to the group after that. Somewhere deep in the fungal forest of Soreth 4, a night creature called out. Once, and then went silent. That silence lasted too long. Rael, sitting with his back against a root and his eyes open in the dark, noted the length of it and did not sleep. The others slept. Dova in the compact Sulvari way, folded tight, nearly still. Bren like a fallen building. Sura with one hand still resting near her medkit, which Rael thought said something honest about her. Oru breathed in slow rhythms, deep and even, the sleep of someone who had decided a long time ago to trust the universe slightly more than it deserved. The camp was a flat clearing where 3 enormous roots converged and then spread apart, forming a natural enclosure. Rael had chosen it. Good sightlines. On 2 sides. The roots provided cover on the 3rd. He had set no traps. He did not want to injure something and make it angry when he did not yet know what it was. He had only notched the bark of 4 trees around the perimeter. Small cuts, chest height on him. 3 meters up on the local fauna. The pheromone reader sat in his palm. It had given a low pulse just after sundown, a faint signature, distant, moving parallel to their path rather than toward them. He had checked the direction and put it back in his pocket. Telling the group now would mean questions, and questions meant noise, and noise meant information given away for free. He would tell them in the morning, calmly, if it was still there. It was still there. Morning in the fungal forest arrived not as light, but as a slow brightening of the spore glow, the bioluminescence shifting from pale blue-white to something warmer as the gas giant above caught the star's angle. The canopy never fully lit. It stayed twilight all day, and that was something else nobody had told Rael in the briefing, though he had read the survey notes carefully enough to expect it. Dova was the first awake after him. She unfolded herself, ran a quick self-diagnostic the Sulvari way, eyes moving in a fast internal inventory, and then noticed that Rael was already awake and had clearly been so for some time. Did you sleep? She asked, not with concern, with data gathering instinct. Some, he said, which was true in the way that 1 hour counted as some. She started her scanner and swept the immediate area. Clean readings. She looked satisfied. Rael looked at the tree line and did not comment on her satisfaction. They broke camp quietly. Bryn ate his rations in 4 bites and looked embarrassed about it. Sura checked Oru's joints with a practiced efficiency that the elder tolerated with patient dignity. Rael walked the camp perimeter. Before they left, he found what he expected. 2 of his trail notches had been investigated in the night. The bark around them had been scraped. Not bitten, scraped, by something. With flat, hard edges, like the front of a bone plate. The scrapes were at 3 meters. The force behind them had pushed inward almost 2 centimeters into living wood. He measured the distance between scrape marks with his hand span. Wide. Very wide. He covered the marks with his palm for a moment, thinking. Then he rejoined the group. You are quiet, Sura said, walking beside him an hour later, after the others had moved slightly ahead. Habit, he said. She looked at him sideways. Tority eyes were set wide and golden, and they caught light in a way that made their expressions readable even to other species. Hers said she was choosing her next words carefully, which was not her usual approach. You have done this a long time, she said. It was not a question. Long enough, he said. Have you ever lost someone you were meant to protect? The question sat between them for a moment. The spores drifted. Something small and fast moved through the undergrowth to the right and was gone. Once, he said. She waited. I learned from it, he said. She did not push further. She had enough experience with pain to recognize when an answer was complete, even when it was short. They walked on, and she thought about the way he had said it. Not with guilt, not with grief worn on the surface, with something quieter. A door, closed firmly, with whatever was needed behind it. By mid-afternoon, they had covered good ground. Oru, consulting the old Solvari charts rendered on his wrist display, said they were less than 2 hours from the artifact site. The mood lifted. Dova began cataloging species with more energy. Bryn started explaining something complicated about root structure load tolerances to Sura, who listened with the patience of someone who had heard this before but found it less annoying than silence. Rail walked and watched. The pheromone reader pulsed twice in his pocket. He checked it without stopping. The signature was closer now. Still parallel. Not converging, but closer. He looked at the forest to the east. The mist sat thick in the low ground. Between the root columns, slow-moving and pale. Nothing visible. Nothing moving. That he could see. But the forest sounds had changed in a way that was very small and very clear. To anyone who knew how to listen. The lower layer of background noise, the small things, the insects, the ground dwellers, had gone quiet in a long strip. To the east, something was moving through that strip. Something large enough that everything else had simply stopped. Rill did not break stride. He quietly confirmed, for the third time that day, that the blade at his back was positioned for a 1-second draw. Then he kept walking, and said nothing, and let the others have their good mood. For as long as they could. The artifact chamber entrance was not what any of them expected. There was no arch, no carved stone, no deliberate marker. It was just a place where the root lattice grew apart instead of together, leaving a low gap in the earth beneath. A dark mouth in the ground, framed by the living wood of 3 ancient trunks that had spent centuries slowly leaning away from it, as if even the trees had some old reason to give it space. Aura saw it and stopped walking entirely. He stood there for a long moment. His breathing changed. Dova, who had never seen the elder show anything other than calm, noticed it and said nothing. Bren noticed it too, and the big Torati went still in the way large creatures go. Still when they understand something is fragile nearby. Sura put her hand briefly on Oru's arm, just rested it there, and that was enough. This is it, Oru said finally. His voice was very quiet. This is the place. Dova's scanner was already running. The readings from the chamber below were remarkable, material composition consistent with pre-spaceflight Solvari. Metalwork, deep preservation, minimal decay. She began talking through the data. In the quick, clipped way she used when she was genuinely excited and trying not to show it. Bryn moved toward the entrance and began carefully clearing debris, loose soil, dead root matter that had accumulated over the gap. Rail stood apart from all of it. He had not moved toward the chamber. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, facing east, where the mist sat in the low ground between the root columns. He was looking at nothing visible. His hand was in his jacket pocket, holding the pheromone reader. It had gone silent. Not low, not faint, completely silent. He pulled it out and checked it. The device was functioning. The sensor was active. The readings were simply flat, as if there was nothing in range, or as if something had moved so close that it was no longer approaching and therefore no longer generating the forward motion pheromone trace that the device was calibrated to catch. Rail turned around slowly. 30 meters away, standing absolutely still in the space between 2 root columns, was the Gravone. Nobody had a good description of it in the survey files because nobody who had seen one up close had been in a position to write calmly afterward. What the files had said was 6-limbed, heavily built, natural bone plate armor across the flanks and upper back, electromagnetic disruption capability used as a hunting mechanism to disable prey technology. What the files had not said was the way it looked at you. It was not the look of hunger. It was older than that. It was the look of something that had never in its life needed to decide whether to act. The look of something for which everything in its environment had always been either irrelevant or prey, and which was now in the process of making that classification for the group in front of it. It was 30 meters away. It had made no sound arriving. It made no sound now. It simply looked. Every device in the group died at once. Dova's scanner, Bren's equipment, indicators, Sura's medkit diagnostics. The electromagnetic pulse came not as a dramatic event, but as a simple fact, screens going dark, soft operational, hums cutting off, the sudden weight of silence where technology had been. Dova's instinct arrived before her logic could stop it. She went still, flat. Every Solvari nerve, she had said, do not move, do not attract attention, become small. Bryn had already taken 3 slow steps backward toward the root. Lattice, his eyes down, not meeting the creature's gaze, deep torty threat. Response, trained into the species over generations of coexisting with large predators on their home world. Sura had Oru by the arm and was already moving him toward the chamber entrance. The Gravone took 2 steps forward. Unhurried, the ground felt it. 2 steps became the difference between 30 meters and 20. In 20 meters, with 6 limbs and that weight behind it, the gap would close in seconds. The root lattice was behind the group now, solid, impassable at that section, a wall of living wood. The chamber entrance was low and narrow. They could not all get through it fast enough. They were trapped. Dova understood this with the cold precision of her training. She ran the geometry in her head in the span of 1 second and found no solution. Bryn's back was almost against the roots. Sura had pressed Oru into the narrowest part of the entrance gap, but had not gone through herself. There was nowhere to go. There was no play. The Gravone lowered its head, the bone plate on. Its skull angled forward, the posture she now recognized from the behavioral archive entry she had read once and not thought about again until this exact moment, pre-charge. And then a voice spoke. It was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was level and plain and completely calm, the way someone speaks when they have already done the calculation and the calculation is finished. Stand behind me. Dova turned. Rail had moved. He was standing between the group and the Gravone. He had not drawn the blade yet. He was just standing there, facing the creature. 20 meters of open ground between them, looking at it the same way he had looked at everything on this trip, like it was information he was in the process of collecting. Bryn moved first. No hesitation, no thought. He simply moved behind Rail. 1 step, 2, like it was the only sensible direction in the world. Sura pulled Oru fully behind Rail's position without a word. Dova stood still for 1 extra second. Every logical system, she had said this, was irrational. The human had no armor, no superior strength, no biological advantage. Statistically, placing him between the group and the creature changed nothing about the outcome. She moved behind him anyway. She hated that she did it. She did it immediately. Rail did not look back to check that they had moved. He already knew. He kept his eyes on the Gravone, and the Gravone kept its eyes on him, and for 1 suspended moment the forest held completely still around them. Rail did not charge. He did not raise his voice or beat his chest or do any of the things that the behavioral files for a dozen other species listed under threat display. He simply stood, and he changed his posture. It was not a big change. He did not make himself look larger in any dramatic way. He just stopped being still in the passive sense and became still in a different sense, the kind of stillness that has weight to it, that presses outward rather than folding inward. Shoulders level, feet set, his whole body pointing at the Gravone the way a fixed point points, without apology, without any suggestion that it intended to be somewhere else. The Gravone had charged living prey hundreds of times. Prey did one of 2 things. It ran, or it collapsed. This was neither. The creature paused. 1 second. 2. Behind Rail, Dova held her breath. In the survey archive, in the 3 recorded observation events of Gravone hunts, all filmed from safe altitude, there was no instance of it pausing after taking the pre-charge posture. Not one. Rail began speaking. Low, steady, not to them. To himself. A focus habit, old and automatic, the kind that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the fact that putting words to what you saw forced you to actually see it. 6 limbs. Front 2 are the primary strike, heavier knuckled than the rest. Bone plating ends at the shoulder joint. The neck connection is unarmored. Armor on the flank goes all the way to the hip, but thins near the lower joint. It's going to come in straight. Things this size usually do first pass. Sura, pressed against the root wall with Oru, listened to this and felt something that she could not name right away. It was not reassurance. It was something stranger. It took her a moment to identify it. He had been watching this animal since before they even saw it. Every quiet moment, every early morning, every time he had crouched and stood and said nothing, it had all been this. He had already been preparing for exactly this. The Gravone charged. It was fast. For its size, it was deeply, wrongly fast, the way things evolved. In isolation sometimes became fast because there was nothing that had ever needed them to be slow. The ground shook. The spores scattered upward in a pale cloud from the impact of its movement. Rail stepped to the left. Not far. Just enough. He put the base of the nearest root column between himself and the creature's direct line, and the Gravone's first charge hit the root. Instead of him, not because it missed, but because the gap it was aiming for had shifted by precisely enough to redirect it. The root shuddered. Bark exploded off in a long strip. The Gravone hit the wood with its shoulder, and the sound was like a heavy door slamming in a large empty room. It recovered fast. Faster than Rail had hoped, though not faster than he had planned for. It turned, found him, and came again, shorter charge, lower head. Adjusted. Rail had the flare kit out. He did not throw it at the creature. He cracked it against the root beside him and held it out to the side, away from the group. Away from himself, a hard orange-white light, sudden and directed, aimed straight at the sensory cluster above the creature's jaw where the survey notes had mentioned, in one footnote, a possible photoreceptive sensitivity. The Gravone flinched. Not much, but enough. 1 second of broken momentum. Rail used it to move the group. He did not shout directions. He moved himself, diagonal, away from the root wall, toward the left side of the clearing, and trusted that they would follow. The only moving thing between them and the creature. They did. Bren had Oru, moving before Rail's second step landed. Sura came low and fast. Dova moved, with a precise, controlled speed that surprised even herself. The creature came at him again before they had cleared 20 feet. It caught him. Not a full strike. A glancing impact from one of the forward limbs, the bone edge catching his left shoulder, and sighed as he turned into it rather than away, taking the blow across the back and flank instead of the front. The force threw him sideways 3 steps. He hit a root with his shoulder, hard enough that the breath left him for 1 full second. Bren made a sound from behind him. A Torati sound, low and involuntary, the kind that meant something had just cut through the rational layer of his mind and reached somewhere older. Rail pushed off the root. He stood back up. Not slowly, not dramatically, just up, the way you stand when there is still a thing to do and you have not yet done it. He registered the pain in the distant way that people register things they are filing away for later. His left side was not working at full capacity. He adjusted his weight to the right without thinking about it. The creature looked at him. He looked back. Left side of the root arch, he said quietly, picking up the thread of his own narration without missing a beat. It can't fit through sideways. That's the exit. He began moving the group toward it. Not running. Moving, careful, deliberate. Using every second of the creature's recalibration to buy distance. The Gravone tracked them. It would charge again. He knew it would. He needed 40 more feet before it did. He watched it, and he moved, and he did not stop. Behind him, Dova was counting his steps. She did not know why. She counted them anyway. She was watching a human do something she did not have the right word for yet. Every species had a word for running away. Every species had a word for fighting. She was not watching either of those things. She did not have the word for what she was watching. She kept moving and kept looking for it. The Gravone hesitated for the second time. It had charged twice. It had landed 1 solid hit. The small soft creature it was hunting was still standing, still between it and the rest of the prey group, still looking directly at it. The prey group was moving in a direction that led away from open ground and toward the narrowing gap in the root arch, where the Gravone would lose the room its body needed to work properly. None of that should have stopped it. Size and momentum were its tools, had always been its tools, and they had never failed against anything that lived on this moon. But the thing in front of it was doing something wrong. It had taken a strike and stood up. It had redirected a charge without running. It kept its face pointed at the Gravone the way no prey ever did, because prey understood, at the oldest level of understanding, that facing the thing that was going to end you served no purpose. This thing faced it anyway, and the facing had weight to it. The Gravone stood still and tried to resolve this, and could not, and in that moment of irresolvable information it did not charge. 2 seconds. 3. 4. Rail used every one of them. The root arch gap was 8 feet wide and low enough that the group had to duck slightly to move through. Rail moved them through it in order, Sura. First with Oru, then Bren, then Dova. He came through last, backward, facing the clearing until the roots were on both sides of him, and the Gravone was still standing at the edge of the open ground, watching. It tried the gap, pushed its head through, then its forequarters. The bone plating on its shoulders met the roots on both sides. It could not fit through without turning sideways, and turning sideways meant losing sight of the target. And it would not do that. It pulled back. It stood outside the arch. It made a sound for the first time. A low-pressure pulse through its chest cavity, not quite a noise, more a vibration that every member of the group felt in their back teeth. Then it did something none of them expected. It sat down. Not a collapse. Not a retreat. It lowered itself to the ground with the slow, deliberate motion of something that had decided it could wait. Bren made a sound like air leaving a very large container and sat against the wall of the root corridor. Sura was at Rail's side in 3 steps, her kit already open before she reached him. Ribs, Rail said, before she could ask. How many? At least 2. Left side. She worked quickly and carefully, and he let her, standing still against the root wall with his right hand resting at his side and his eyes still on the gap they had come through. The strapping she applied was tight and correct, and he breathed in shallow and even through the process. Dova had found a section of root to sit against, and she had her wrist unit out. The sensors were partially returning. The creature had moved far enough that the electromagnetic interference was weakening. She pulled up the Gravone behavioral archive. She found the 3 observation records and went through them again, now, with different eyes than she had read them with a week ago. On the transit station, she found the relevant entry, no recorded instance of a Gravone breaking off a hunt once the pre-charge posture was adopted. She sat with that fact for a moment. Then Oru spoke. The old elder was sitting with his back against the far wall of the corridor, the artifacts forgotten for the moment, looking at Rail with an expression that Dova recognized from the oldest formal Solvari contexts, the look that preceded the naming of a thing, the look of someone finding the right words for something. That does not have an easy word. Oru spoke in Old Solvari, formal register, slow and clear. Dova translated without thinking. The way she translated things, she was still processing. He made himself the danger, so that we were not. Rail did not understand the language. He looked at Dova. What did he say? She looked back at him. She translated it. She said it accurately, plainly, the way she said factual things. He looked at Oru for a moment. Then he nodded once, a short nod, the kind that means understood and nothing more, and looked back at the gap in the roots. Dova closed her wrist unit. She looked at the side of Rail's face. She thought about Dova's comparative species index, the one she had displayed in the briefing room 3 days ago. She thought about the middle of the range numbers. Not fastest, not strongest, not sharpest sensory profile. Average, average, average. You knew you could not win, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He looked at her. His expression did not change. Didn't need to win, he said. Needed you to reach the arch. Silence. Dova opened her mouth. She was a scientist and a logical mind, and she always had a response, because logic was a system and systems always produced the next step. She sat in the silence and looked for the next step and did not find one. She closed her mouth. Bren had been listening from his spot against the wall. He looked at his own hands for a while, Torati hands, wide and heavily built, strong by any comparative measure, worth something in a fight. He thought about the moment. The Gravone charged, and what his own body had done, which was to step back. He thought about what Rail's body had done, which was the other thing. Rail, Bren said. Rail looked at him. If there had been no arch, No corridor. No way out. He paused. What would you have done? Rail was quiet for a moment. Outside the root gap, the gravone shifted its weight and settled again. The forest spores drifted in the still air of the corridor, pale and faintly glowing. Same thing, Rail said. Bryn stared at him. Same thing, Rail said again, simply. Just for longer. Bryn looked down at his hands again. He did not say anything else. He sat there in the soft bioluminescent light and thought about that for a long time. And the more he thought about it, the more it felt less like bravery and more like a kind of nature, a thing that was not chosen in the moment because it had already been chosen somewhere much earlier, so long ago that the choosing was finished and only the doing remained. He did not have a word for that either. The gravone was gone by dawn. Rail knew it before anyone else woke because the forest sounds changed again. The bottom layer of noise returning first, the small ground creatures resuming their movements in the undergrowth, the canopy above coming back to life in stages the way it always did when a large predator moved on. He sat at the mouth of the root arch in the thin pale light and listened to it return, and when it was fully back he finally let his shoulders drop. His ribs reminded him they existed. He breathed through it. They retrieved the artifacts that morning. The chamber beneath the root lattice was small and dry and very old. The walls were covered in markings that Dova photographed in full before touching anything, which was the correct instinct and which Oru acknowledged with a slow nod. The artifacts themselves were three: a sealed container of fired clay, a disc of worked metal, and a long narrow tablet covered in script so old that Dova's translator only recognized one word in 40. Oru held each of them for a moment before packing them. He did not explain why. Nobody asked him to. There was something in the chamber that made speaking feel like the wrong thing to do. Not grief, not reverence exactly, but something adjacent to both. The weight of a very long time being acknowledged. Rail stood outside the entrance while they worked. The forest was quiet around him in the normal way now. He watched the mist in the eastern low ground. His pheromone reader was in his pocket and gave nothing. Twice on the return trek, it pulsed faintly. The creature somewhere in the forest, still in range, not closing. And twice he checked it and kept walking. They made it back to the shuttle without incident. On the transport climbing out of the moon's atmosphere, the group filed their reports. It was a cooperative requirement. Mission logs submitted before the debrief, independent of each other, before group discussion could influence the individual accounts. Bryn's was 3 paragraphs. He described the encounter in flat practical terms and then added, at the end, one sentence that was not practical at all. The escort performed in a manner I do not have adequate language for, and I have been on 6 previous expeditions. He left it in. Sura's was shorter. She listed injuries: Rail's 2 fractured ribs, deep contusion across the left flank, laceration on the forearm, now treated and stable. Then she wrote, I have worked with escort personnel of 4 different species over 10 years. I have never watched one take a strike, stand back up, and immediately correct their footing to compensate for reduced mobility on the damaged side. He accounted for himself as a variable and adjusted in real time. I am not sure what category to file that under. She filed it under performance notes. It was not wrong. Dova stared at her own report for a long time. She had started it twice. The first version was accurate and useless, numbers and classifications and outcome data that were all correct and missed everything that mattered. She deleted it. The second version tried too hard, reaching for phrasing that would make the logic of what she had seen fit into an existing framework. She deleted that too. She sat in the transport seat and looked out at the gas giant below, enormous and slow turning, the moon already a small disk against it. She thought about her index. She thought about the middle of the range numbers that she had displayed in the briefing room 3 days ago with the confidence of someone who had all the relevant data. She had not had all the relevant data. She opened a new report. She wrote, without the human, none of us return. She submitted it before she could change it. Rail was at the back of the transport, in the last row of seats. He had declined. The medical bay, the ribs were strapped, the laceration was closed. He could manage the flight. He sat with his bag between his feet and his head resting back and his eyes mostly closed. Bryn came to sit across from him about an hour into the flight. He didn't say anything for a while. Rail didn't press him. 6 expeditions, Bryn said eventually. Rail opened his eyes. Before this one, 6 different escort personnel. He thought for a moment. On the third one, we had a Drevathi. Strongest species in the cooperative at that. Body size. He was very good. He paused. When the threat came, he moved back. With us. Rail said nothing. Not because he was afraid, Bryn said carefully. He was brave. He just moved back because that was the sensible direction. He looked at Rail. You did not have a sensible direction, and it did not seem to matter. Rail thought about that. It mattered, he said. It just wasn't the deciding thing. Bryn nodded slowly. What was the deciding thing? Rail was quiet for a moment. Outside, the gas giant filled the viewport. Slow and massive and indifferent. You were behind me, he said. Bryn sat with that. It was a short answer. It was also, he realized after a while, a complete one. Later, after Bryn went back to his seat, Rail reached into his bag and found a small notebook. Paper. Analog. He had carried it for years, through a dozen different assignments on a dozen different worlds, and the pages were mostly full of exactly this kind of entry, a line or two, dated, a note made for the next time. He opened it to the next blank page. He wrote the date. He wrote, Gravone. Sorith 4. Bone plate gap at shoulder junction. Sensory cluster. Above jaw responds to direct light. Arch gap too narrow for full body width. Momentum can be redirected with root structures. Will hesitate if prey does not behave like prey. Remember. He closed it. He put it back in his bag. He looked out the viewport for a moment at the shrinking moon, the copper smelling forests now invisible from this distance, the place of return now sealed again and quiet. Then he closed his eyes, and this time he actually slept, because the work was done and the people behind him were safe, and those were the only 2 things that had ever really mattered.